This week's Technique Tuesday video is the second video in a series on how to convert written stitch pattern instructions for flat knitting into instructions for knitting in the round. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. Last week, I showed you how to take a basic knit purl stitch pattern that had written instructions intended for flat knitting and how to convert those written instructions so that you could use the same stitch pattern while knitting in the round. We're going to take it to the next level this week, and we're going to be working with stitch patterns that require a multiple of some number of stitches plus some extra stitches, and how we convert those patterns in the round, and then how we might need to eliminate the extra stitches in some situations but not eliminate them in others. Here I have a pretty simple stitch pattern that requires a multiple of 4 stitches plus 1. A multiple of 4 stitches plus 1 means that you multiply the 4 stitches by the number of times you want to repeat the pattern across the row, and then you add 1 stitch. So if you wanted to repeat it twice, you'd multiply the 4 stitches by 2, which would give you 8, and then you'd add the 1 and you'd have 9. If you wanted 3 repeats, you'd multiply the 4 stitches times 3, which would give you 12. You'd add 1 and you'd get 13. If you wanted 10 repeats, it would be 4 stitches times 10, which is 40, and then you would add the 1 stitch to get 41. So the extra stitch is always added after you have multiplied the number of stitches in the multiple by the number of times that you want to repeat it. It's a very simple pattern. The wrong side rows are very easy to convert because wrong side rows are purl, and the opposite of a purl is a knit. So both of those rows, the odd rows, are just going to be converted into knit rows, and which means that the even rows that were right side rows to begin with can be charted immediately. Again, this is a multiple of 4 stitches plus 1, and you can see in this instruction here that what we have in the parentheses is a 4-stitch repeat. So, and this is the part that gets repeated over and over, but we have a single purl stitch at the beginning. So what I'm going to do on row number 2 is I'm going to just outline the 4 stitches that are going to be repeated. So we have 4 stitches right here. I can use a different color for the next 4 stitches. 4 stitches right here, and then we'll have the 3rd repeat right here. So typically what I do when I'm charting a written stitch pattern into a charted pattern, I will chart at least 2 multiples, so that's the horizontal repeat, or they're called multiples. And since this is a small number, I'm going to do 3. And then I will chart 2 of the repeats, the vertical repeats. So this is a 4-row repeat. So what I'm going to do here is chart 3 multiples going across and 3 repeats going up. So this is pretty easy. That first stitch is a purl stitch. We're going to use a dot for a purl and a blank box for a knit. And then it's knit 3, purl 1, and then repeat. So I have 3 blank boxes and a purl stitch all the way across. So this is very easy to chart. And again, the odd rows, the wrong side rows, would have been purled if we were knitting flat, which means that they are going to be knit when we are working in the round. So now we want to look at row 4, which also starts with a purl stitch, and then it's knit 1, purl 1, and you repeat that all the way across. So it's knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. All the way across. If we fill in this entire chart, we get a sense of what the entire stitch pattern looks like, but this is the actual multiple and repeat. This is what each one of those 4 stitches by 4 rows looks like, and this column is that single purl stitch that was worked on the right side rows. So what is that extra stitch for? Well, it's creating symmetry. So this symmetry is needed when you are knitting flat, or when you are knitting in the round, but you are not knitting across all of the stitches. It's so that you are creating a panel of stitches that has this stitch pattern in it, but you create the symmetry at the edges of that panel. But if you are working in an all-over pattern where you want the entire round to be worked in the stitch pattern, that is when you would eliminate the stitches that are there for symmetry. So in this case, we could just eliminate that first column of stitches, and then we could just work our 4-stitch repeat over a multiple of 4 stitches. So this is a sock where I did that, where I had 56 stitches, so that's a multiple of 4, and I just could work that stitch pattern across all of the stitches for the entire round, and it worked really well. I didn't need that column of stitches that are used for symmetry. But when I worked the foot, I didn't work that stitch pattern across all of the stitches. I only worked it across the instep. So I wanted the sole of the sock to be worked in stockinette. So typically when you're knitting something like this, like a sock, you would divide the sole and the instep into 2 halves, and you would work the sole in stockinette, and you'd keep the stitch pattern for the instep. And you would divide the round in half, and so that would mean 28 stitches for the sole and 28 for the instep. The problem with doing that is, even though 28 stitches is a 4-stitch repeat, if we eliminate that column of symmetry and only work across the 28 stitches of the instep, we don't have that symmetry within that panel of stitches. Here I've done a swatch using that same stitch pattern, and if we look at just what's below my thumbs right here, you can see that I just worked the 4-stitch multiple. I have some stockinette stitches leading up to this span of the stitch pattern, and the first column of stitches in the stitch pattern is a column of stockinette. So that's just blending in with the other stockinette that I have to the right. And then the first column that has any stitch, purl stitches in it, has 1 every 4 rows. So it's just occasionally. And then you finally get this column of the garter stitch, and then the pattern repeats all the way across. So over on the right, you have this column of garter stitch where there's a purl bump every other row. But over here, you've only got 1 every so often, and it's not in balance. So if I switch that so that I am using a multiple of 4 stitches plus 1, then you see how the pattern looks more symmetrical. For this example, I want to use a stitch pattern from one of Barbara Walker's treasuries of knitting patterns. This is the second treasury. So on page 13 of this book, she has 2 versions of what she calls moss and rib block stitch. So you'll see 4 stitch patterns. So this is version 2 right here, viewed from one face of the fabric, and this is what it looks like on the backs. What you'll see here is that version 2 calls for a multiple of 12 stitches plus 7. So it's fairly easy to chart out because the odd rows will explain how you are to work the stitches, and we're going to interpret this as being the right side of the fabric. All of the even rows are worked, the stitches are worked as they present, which means if they look like a knit, you knit it, and if it looks like a purl, you purl it. In order to convert that to knitting in the round, the instruction is exactly the same. If it looks like a knit, you knit it, and if it looks like a purl, you purl it. So you don't have to do any real conversion for these even number rows, you just have to duplicate whatever you did for the previous row. So you'll see that row 3 is different than row 1, but row 5 is a repeat of row 1. So there's really only 3 rows of pattern in this 12-row pattern that you have to actually chart out. What I want to draw your attention to is how the written instructions are presented. So we know that this is a multiple of 12 stitches plus 7. So when we look at this first row, it says purl 1, knit 1 3 times. That's 6 stitches. And then you see the asterisk, and it explains what to do. All of the stitches in here, that adds up to 12 stitches. So that's the repeat. So you're repeating that over and over again until you get to the end of the row and you have one stitch left. And so you are going to purl that. So the extra stitches on row 1, you have 6 at the beginning and 1 at the end. If you look at row 3, you really can't tell because you have 1 extra stitch at the beginning, and then you just repeat knit 1, purl 1 for the entire row. So the extra stitches as well as this 12 stitch repeat are all worked exactly the same. So let me show you what that looks like on the chart. So here on row 1 are those first 6 stitches where it said to purl 1 and knit 1 3 times. That's those stitches right here. And then the part that they have repeated in the asterisks is this. Now I've created a chart that will allow for 2 repeats plus the extra 7 stitches. As I explained in the previous example, it really is helpful to me if I have at least 2 multiples of the stitch pattern in my chart so that I can really see how things flow. So here's that 12 stitch repeat that in that first row. So the next 12 stitches are repeated the same, and then this final purl stitch is what ends the row. In row 3, you have the initial purl stitch, and then the repeat is these 2 stitches. For row 5, you repeat row 1, but for row 7, we have a new set of instructions. And what we see here is knit 1, purl 1 twice, so that's 4 stitches. And then we have a knit 1 that makes 5. And now we have the 12 stitch repeat. And this time we're going to end the row with 2 stitches, a purl 1 and a knit 1. So if we look at what's being repeated, it's these stitches right here. These 12 stitches get repeated, and then you end with this purl 1 and knit 1. So if you look at the chart like this, you have to wonder, well, where are the extra stitches that I would eliminate? How do I figure that out? And why are they presenting the instructions like this? Why don't they present them so that you can tell where those extra stitches are? The reason that this kind of thing can happen where the repeat occurs over a different columns of stitches from one row to another, it's because written instructions are presented in a way that is most efficient. There are always multiple options for how you can present a sequence of stitches. In this particular case, there are likely a couple of reasons why she chose to do this, but one of them would be that the sequence of stitches that are surrounded as the repeat are exactly the same for all of the rows, even though they don't occur in the same place within the row. So essentially what we are looking for is what is the real 12 stitch repeat and what are the 7 stitches that need to get removed. I can use this as an aid to help me figure out, okay, these are squares are going to be 6 stitches, probably going to be 6 stitches wide and 6 stitches tall in order to get something that is a repeat that's 12 stitches wide and 12 rows long. I divided it up, and what you see is that you have got this symmetry that they're looking for in flat patterns where the 2 ribbing patterns are symmetrical within the row horizontally, so you have the moss stitch on either side here. When you work in the round, though, you are not going to want those extra 6 stitches. So are you going to get rid of the ones at the beginning, or are you going to get rid of the ones at the end? We can see that this one, that's one of the 7 stitches that we're getting rid of right here. And that one is identical to this first column. So we know that that one's we're going to get rid of. But are we going to get rid of this block, or are we going to get rid of that block? Well, let's take a look and see what we notice is going on. So every time we start a new block, if we look at the ones that are in here, every time we start a new block, there's a complete column of purl stitches going up. So the first stitch is always a purl stitch, whether it's a ribbing or a moss stitch. So that's a vertical division between these blocks. And what we don't see is that column of purls right here in this one. So this block is not the same as all of the other green blocks. So this is the one that's different. So this is the one that we're going to take out. So our round is going to start with that column of purl stitches, and it's going to end with this 6th stitch of this final block, and we're going to eliminate of that final column here. So we're going to get rid of this block of 6 stitches, and we're also going to get rid of this final stitch at the very end in order to be able to work this completely in the round over all of the stitches. So the final chart that could be used, whether you are working with symmetry or without symmetry, would look like this. So you have the first 6 stitches here, you have your block of 12 stitches by 12 stitches here that is repeated, and then you have your final column of stitches here. So if you are working in the round, but you are working in a panel and you want to create symmetry, you would use this whole chart. You work the first 6 stitches, then you would repeat these 12 stitches over and over again until you get to your last stitch, and then you'd work that column. If you wanted to work an all-over pattern, work consistently in the round across all of the stitches, then you would only work stitches within here. You'd work a multiple of 12 stitches. For the entire round, where if you were working a panel, you would work a multiple of 12 stitches plus those 7 extra. If you'd like a PDF of the written instructions for the moss and rib block stitch in an example 2, including the different charts, there is a link down in the video description. The next video in this series will demonstrate how to deal with wrong side row instructions for actions that are not basic knits and purls, such as yarn overs and decreases. The videos for this ongoing series on converting flat knitting to in the round knitting will be included in this new playlist right over here as they are published. For videos on reading and using knitting charts, you can check out this playlist over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.